I'm Anna Pena, Community Research and Data Analyst at UNHP. We're based in the Bronx, and we'll be presenting on our Syncter data dashboard. Maxwell.
Thanks. Yeah, my name is Maxwell Austinson. I'm a software engineer with JustFix, which is a nonprofit based in New York City that works with technology to support tenant organizing and general kind of housing justice work. Yeah.
So we're going to talk about how we use open data to support tenant organizing in the wake of the Signature Bank collapse. So a little bit of background on the Signature collapse and Signature Bank, an explanation of why this gives us opportunities, the goals of the dashboard and co-creation process, how we use Open Data Foundation for the dashboard, a live demo of the Signature Portfolio dashboard, and practical uses of the dashboard. The story begins in March of 2023 when Signature Bank collapsed. At the time, Signature Bank was one of the largest multifamily lenders in New York City. And at the time of the collapse, it nearly contained 3,000 portfolios with almost 80% of these buildings likely containing rent-stabilized units. Tenants and community organizations were well aware of the Signature Bank due to their large portfolio size and their reputation for lending to neglectful landlords. After this collapse, the FDIC took over receivership, and this meant that they had the responsibility of finding new loan holders. Tenants and advocates pushed for the FDIC to engage tenants in their search for new loan servicers. What this meant is that when Signature Bank collapsed, their loans were ultimately not owned by a loan servicer. So as a federal regulator, the FDIC came in and took ownership of these loans. As part of their job, the FDIC's job was to transfer these loans to another servicer and recover as many assets that were lost during the collapse. And as a result of this tenant engagement, the FDIC announces 2 joint ventures with community stabilization partners and Santander Bank to service these loans on rent-regulated housing. So each of these joint ventures receives different pools of the loans, and any of the loans on other types of properties that were not rent stabilized, including commercial properties, were sold to other banks. When CPC and Santander received these loans, they agreed to the terms of the joint venture that required them to maximize the availability and affordability of residential properties for low and moderate income tenants. They were also required to fulfill their responsibilities to maximize recovery on assets. What this basically means is that they agreed to ensure that tenant stability, building safety, and responsible operations and ownerships were prioritized while also meeting their responsibilities to the borrowers. Both CPC and Santander are now in the position of being able to address tenant conditions through a sticks and carrots systems where the mortgage agreement is a negotiating tool. I'll pass it on to Maxwell.
Thanks. Yeah, so given this really new and unique system that all of these properties found themselves in, with the new joint ventures taking over the mortgages for all of these buildings, many of which were in a kind of state of financial and physical kind of distress, with tenants living in with really bad conditions a lot of the time, it presents a lot of new opportunities, as Anna was saying, to address those issues, and provides a really big organizing opportunity for tenants in the buildings, because for the first time, given this new arrangement, the owners of the mortgages are a way that you can go above the landlord directly to those organizations which hold the loans and have some power over the landlords, and themselves are, and for the first time, incentivized to actually force the landlord to make some of these changes, since that's in their requirements for how they're managing all of these new loans. And we knew this would be a really exciting kind of tenant organizing opportunity, and that a lot of organizations would be interested in identifying these properties and engaging in some proactive outreach to tenants in the buildings. And so we wanted to be able to build a tool that would support that. But furthermore, because of this kind of unique alignment of incentives with these other actors like the FDIC and the joint ventures, as well as some government stakeholders that are involved in different ways, we wanted to open this up and make sure that we're able to work with a bunch of different audiences and include some of these groups because of the benefit of being able to have a common set of data to look at. And for tenants and organizers in the building trying to make the case to the new mortgage holders, these joint ventures, that they need to take action and force the landlord to make repairs, whether that's through the negotiation that Anna mentioned over the mortgage itself, where you might be able to write down some of the debt that the landlord owes and isn't able to pay back in exchange for doing like capital repairs in the building and improving conditions. And in some cases, they might even decide to foreclose on some of these landlords and bring in a new landlord that might be able to, improve conditions, or maybe there's even a possibility for like tenants to take over the building and themselves. And so there's a lot of like really exciting opportunities that we're trying to figure out, but we wanted to engage all the groups in the process. And what that looked like is we wanted to start from the goals of all of the different groups to understand what their role in the process is and what they were trying to achieve. And then from that, what then their kind of workflows would be in terms of researching the properties and how they might want to use a dashboard to support that work, and then translate that into what are the features that the dashboard really needs to have to provide that kind of tool for all of these different groups. For an example, all the groups would really want to know like a really comprehensive profile of every building. And so we knew we wanted to pull in as much data as we could that would be useful to folks to give a really holistic picture of what's going on in the building. So whether that's for organizers that are deciding which buildings they might want to reach out to, or that's the joint ventures evaluating which are the properties in the most distress that kind of need their intervention first or most, or it might be other actors like that. And so we know we wanted to have building profiles. We want to be able to search by the address as well as the landlord. So a lot of the time, like in tenant organizing in general, the target is going to be the landlord, and you want to spread your organizing across multiple properties that they own to increase your power in those kind of negotiations. And the same is going to be true here, but also from the other side, the joint ventures are going to want to look at the landlord level to see who some of the worst actors are and get a kind of more holistic picture of all of the properties and what's going on across all of them to deal with that negotiation in the most informed way. And then we know a lot of tenant organizing is taking place at the neighborhood level, whether that's like local tenant unions or other kind of community-based groups. The kind of geography is going to be really important. So we need to have maps to be able to have that as a jumping off point. And so the way we went about learning all of this and being able to translate into what we need for the dashboard was a kind of involved process of lots of collaboration and co-design with these different groups, particularly kind of tenant organizing groups, but it also included others from representatives from the other joint ventures and FDIC as well. And so what this looked like is like from the very beginning, doing interviews to understand their goals, a lot of kind of interactive workshops of sorting through what are the kind of priorities to know about a building in terms of the indicators and the data that we're bringing to it. A lot of kind of early prototypes from us and user testing on their end, really walking through in practice to see how it is that they plan to use it. What are the kind of pain points? How do we design around that and then adapt? And also learning from them what they want to see and getting new ideas. So one group that was particularly helpful and we were really closely working with is called Stabilizing NYC. They're a coalition of tenant orgs that have done a lot of organizing in these signature finance properties since even before the collapse. So they're really deeply knowledgeable about the situation in these buildings and really understand the opportunity that this collapse has presented. And we knew that they were going to be doing some really like dedicated outreach to these buildings after the collapse as things were settling and we understood the new landscape. And so we were involved really closely with them in a lot of this work. And so moving to the actual kind of like building of the dashboard itself and the content. So open data is really the foundation of this project completely, as well as all of our work, particularly at JustFix. So this dashboard itself contains over 25 different data sets, most of which are coming directly from NYC open data, as well as a few other sources that we put together or get through agencies and that sort of thing. But this is a huge amount of data, a lot of it updating at different frequencies, some like daily. And so we want to have the most up-to-date information as possible. And to help manage that whole process, we rely on this open source project called NYCDB. It's maintained by the Housing Data Coalition, which is like a volunteer group of folks that work with data for kind of housing justice projects. And basically, it's a Python tool that helps you extract from open data and other sources the data that you need, do some kind of minimal cleaning of it, and then get it loaded into a SQL database where you're able to make the connections between all of these different data sets, which we're going to need to do to be able to bring in information from all these different sources, match it at the building level, generate some of these indicators, and start to build out the data that will actually power the dashboard. If you're interested in hearing more about this, we're actually, as part of the Housing Data Coalition, doing a workshop at the Saturday in-person School of Data conference. So definitely check that out if you're interested in learning more. But once we have all of the data, then the task is to create some useful indicators from it that are going to be helpful to all of these different audiences. So a big kind of bucket of that is some representation of the physical condition of the buildings. That's going to be things like housing code complaints and violations with DOB, everything from like rodent inspections from the health department to housing court filing cases for evictions or harassment, things like that. All of that is getting pulled together to give some kind of idea of the physical condition, kind of repair issues that are going on in the building. And then especially important for this project because it's related to the financing and the mortgages. And a lot of these properties were very over leveraged with these loans that they got from Signature, which is putting a lot of the pressure that they're not then spending on maintenance and that sort of thing. And this also, their financial situation dictates a little bit the kind of leverage that we might have in those negotiations with the landlords. So we want to have some measure of their kind of current situation with the loan with Signature, as well as other kind of measures of financial distress. So that might be like unpaid water bills, or that they're like racking up lots of fines or charges through HPD's emergency repairs program, for example, something like that. And then where possible, we try to get a little bit creative with the data and try to give some useful information around organizing opportunity or insights there. So that might be something like pulling a list of all the actual apartment numbers that have made 311 complaints recently. And so that, you know, if you're going to knock on doors, these are some of the first ones that you might want to start with, or turn that around into what's the percent of units in a building that have made 311 complaints in the last few months or something like that. Get a sense of like how widespread issues are, how activated tenants might already be in the building. Other points to that might be like, are they bringing tenant initiated cases in housing court against the landlord? These are all sorts of things that we're trying to pull together for that full picture. In addition to the data that we're working with directly from Open Data, UNHP and Azoric provides a lot of data that we use as well. They have an existing data set called the Building Indicators Project that kind of puts together a few of these indicators into a single metric of physical and financial distress that can be a kind of helpful like kind of priority ranking of buildings and a kind of like quick overview of the situation in the building. But then they also undertook a great deal of manual research to bring in some of the data that we really needed. Landlord identification was the main thing. They're needing to look through all of the buildings in the portfolio, which is over 2,000 properties, see the actual mortgages that they took out with Signature, when that happened, how much the loan was for, and then who is the actual landlord. So who's like signing on those mortgages. We all know that there's a lot of use of LLCs to obscure ownership, and it can be difficult to get beyond that and piece together the entire portfolio. And so a lot of manual work was done to find those names, match them, and then figure out who the actual kind of like known person or entity it is that owns them, that people would recognize, whether that's on the bank side of who they're dealing with or tenant organizing, who are the big targets. And so that was really crucial for all of this. And I just also wanted to shout out DCP's Planning Labs. They put together this really amazing address lookup API called GeoSearch that allows you to have a search bar to go from a typed address that people know and deal with all the kind of complexities of kind of alternative addresses and things like that, and get down to like a building identifier that we can work with. And we use this across all our tools, but they also make all of the data and code open source. And so for this project, we were able to rebuild from that work ourselves a kind of scaled down version that's like just for the Signature properties, which was a really nice feature. And yeah, so everything really relies on open data and allows us to do this work. With that, I'll switch to just like a live walkthrough of the site itself and some of the things that you can do with it. And then we'll move into some more kind of practical use cases that we've actually seen or Anna has some experience with. The site overall, you get an overview of the scale of it here with just how many properties are actually involved and the number of landlords that are in the portfolio overall. To really see that and really understand it, I think the map really brings that home. There's just so many properties that are part of this portfolio now and had been financed by Signature. Some really clustered in neighborhoods. So you can see in some places where a huge number of the properties are all from Signature. As I mentioned, we have been working closely with Stabilizing NYC, and one of the things that kind of came out of that collaboration was they're trying to coordinate between all their members' outreach to these buildings. And so we helped them to map out their own kind of like catchment areas, like essentially for their different orgs. And this was a layer that we added on for their use. But it allows you to look through. So if, for example, if you're part of like CASA and the Bronx doing organizing there, you can look through and see which buildings are in your area and know where you might want to coordinate with our other folks to make sure you're not duplicating work there and showing up to the same places. But you can just click on any one of these and see the landlord, one of the joint ventures that it's in, and then the address, and we can go and check out what one of these building profiles looks like. So we have some of the basic information about the address. You can download all of the information. We give a kind of quick overview of some of the like most important indicators that we think people might be interested in, but then I'll just go through the whole list here to show everything. So a lot of kind of contextual information about the building, its size, basic things that you might want to know if you're first hearing about this building. We give that building indicator score, and for any one of these indicators, you can click through to see a more detailed description of how we're actually putting this indicator together, where it comes from, when it was last updated. We've also got a lot of the financial information here, so you can see broken down even like at a kind of per unit level how much they still owe on the loans from Signature, and that gives you an idea of what they can do to try to negotiate with these landlords and get things changed. And then a lot of the stuff that I talked about, so like HPD violations, we've got this all from one data source, but cut a lot of different ways to be useful in different contexts or for different audiences. And so just the overall kind of number of open violations that are outstanding, but also broken down on a per unit basis, dealing with a little bit of a better comparison across buildings of different sizes. But then we also dig into the more detailed information about kind of the nature of the violation. And so you can see that there's a lot, particularly for pests or for leaks and mold, and you can get into that level of detail. HPD complaints, as I was mentioning, we can give that list of unit numbers, which can be really helpful, and organizers have given us feedback that is something that's really useful for them when they're making plans to go out door knocking. You can see that a quarter of the building has made complaints in just the last 12 months. We've got everything from emergency repairs when things are so severe and the landlord's not acting, that HPD actually sends folks out to actually make those repairs themselves and charge the landlord. That's another kind of good indicator of serious kind of neglect from the landlord. Yeah, and everything from rodent inspections, eviction filings, as well as executed warrants of eviction. We've got a lot that we put together here, different cases and special programs that they might be involved in through HPD. So this one in particular is part of the Certificate of No Harassment pilot program. So this might be special context for you to understand whether you're on the organizing side or from like the joint ventures as well. And then we try to give a little picture of that over time. So this is just from the last couple of years, but you can also zoom out to see all the way back to 2010, and you can see when the current landlord took over the building, as well as when they took out their loan from Signature. And in this case, we can see that things are getting worse, it seems, and there's some serious spikes in just the last year or two here in this building. Similarly, for complaints, it's a similar picture. But we've got this as well for DOP violations, permits, rent stabilized units, which all of these properties are rent stabilized. You can also see if any of them had like lost units over time to deregulation. And then you can always follow up with your own research, and we provide some helpful links out to known government websites that are often used by folks here to make that a little bit easier. And then you can also kind of zoom out a little bit to the landlord. So we know what's going on in this building, but what's going on with this landlord overall. And so they had 9 properties that are formally Signature financed that are included in this. And now we've got some kind of aggregated information across all of their properties here that you can see and get a better picture of what's going on. So they've got some really high rates of violations generally. So just over the past 12 months, there's almost 3 per unit across these 9 buildings. Again, see the picture, but for the whole portfolio, and get a map of kind of where the properties are. And then this is like the biggest kind of data exploration part of this is you can see all the properties from this landlord in this case, and you can sort through and see all of the indicators that we were looking through on the building level. You can now see row by row for each building in the portfolio and be able to sort and organize. So this is just for the 9 that are in this landlord, but let's actually jump and zoom out even further to the entire set of Signature financed properties. So we've got all 2,000 plus here in the same format, and we can start to sift through. So if you're imagining maybe you're part of a citywide tenant coalition and looking for kind of target buildings, or you're coming from one of the joint ventures and they're trying to find like what are the properties that we need to intervene in first and prioritize in that way, you can start to use this. So maybe you're only looking for larger properties that are like 50 units or more, for example. You can filter that here and it gets applied. And then you can start looking through all of these. So you can just sort by the number of open violations and immediately see what are some of the worst conditions, or by unit size. And then we see this A&E is showing up a lot here. That might be a landlord to look out for, but you can keep going through all of these different indicators and filter in different ways to see what you're most interested in. Some of the most severe cases might be when the entire building has a vacate order out for it. All of these things are accessible here through these different filters and sort mechanisms, as well as all of this gets encoded in the URL so you can do all of your filtering. You can even hide particular columns and then share this link out with other folks, whether that's other folks that might be organizing with or otherwise could share it with your constituent services folks, or facilitating a little bit more of the kind of interaction between all of these groups. If you're trying to build your case at the building level that one of the joint ventures needs to take action, you can also be sharing this back, and it's something they're already familiar with and can see and work with in that way. Yeah, so as we saw, like, this is one landlord that looks like they've got a lot of buildings that are in particularly bad shape. So you can actually also look at the landlord level. So again, using some of the same aggregated information across each landlord portfolio, and you can sort through them that way and see these are the largest ones. So this A&E has over 100 buildings, almost 7,000 residential units that are part of this portfolio. Just right there is a big target that folks are already had been organizing around, and this gives you another angle into that work. Yeah, so maybe now like shift, and Anna can share a little bit more about an actual practical use case that she has, and I'll just follow along with a little bit of how you might sort that out on the dashboard.
Yeah. So the example comes from the Northern Manhattan Improvement Corporation. A tenant had reached out to them from a building, 4646 Broadway, and using tools like JustFix, so who owns what, they identified that it was a property that was formerly financed by Signature. Yeah, by Signature. And once that tenant had reached out, they looked that up, and they also found out that there were other buildings that were on the same block that were also formerly Signature financed. So Maxwell's going to show like how they may have walked through that. And immediately, instead of reaching out and organizing just the building, they were able to organize the whole block and get tenants on the whole block, organizing not only around addressing their issues to the landlord, but also to the loan servicer as well.
Yeah, that's great. And I'll close up the demo here, and yeah, we can share like any more about other kind of like use cases.
As we explained, there are many uses to the dashboard, including lenders using it to identify borrowers for negotiations, organizers and community organizations identifying portfolios for strategic organizing. We just use Aaron Youngrice portfolio. He is also a portfolio that's currently being organized across the boroughs due to how large they are, and the dashboard was used to identify them, and as well as the Sugar Hill Capital portfolio. We also hope to use the dashboard as a long-term analysis on the success of the joint ventures. And this is where we'll leave space for questions.
Yeah, and we'll also be following up after this presentation as well to share some more links and kind of information about that you might want to check out. But yeah, we've got some questions here. How to get a password. Yeah, so there's a kind of concern with a lot of these kind of open data tools around building conditions and things like that, because they can be used by bad actors in a way of targeting for speculation. And we know that this is like very clearly pointing out properties that are in distress and could be at risk of that. And so we've kept the password at the moment. So if you want to email us after this, and we'll also be following up to share the email with everyone that registered. But if you just want to reach out and just let us know that you want access and what you're looking to use it for, we can also share passwords and make sure that you can get access to it. And then we've got a question here about how does money owed on the loan translate into negotiating power?
I can answer that. So the way that the money owed on the loan translates to negotiating power is the loan servicer. Think of the mortgage agreement as similar to the way that tenants have their contractual agreement with the landlord. The mortgage agreement is that same contractual relationship between the borrower and the loan servicer. Within that mortgage agreement, there may be conditions such as the landlord has to upkeep conditions in the building, and that's one of the conditions that the borrower must have. A lot of these buildings are in distress and some of the borrowers are in distress. And now the loan servicer has this negotiating power where they have the ability to address that financial distress condition. They can do things such as renegotiating interest rates or pushing back what they call like interest only payments where they're not required to pay on the loan itself, but only the interest rate. So they can have periods where they only do that, which in turn allow the borrower or the landlord to get pools of money that they may not have had access to previously to the negotiations. That being said, the hope is that in negotiating with landlords that they're also addressing the physical conditions of tenants. So that's how they have negotiating power there.
We also have a question about the data and how it's updated. Yeah, as Andrew shared in the chat, it's using this program called NYCDP, which kind of handles the kind of like extracting, transforming, and loading the data into the database. And then on top of that, at JustFix, we add on a little bit of a feature to turn each one of those jobs that updates one of the data sets into like a cron job that runs on a schedule. And we have these kind of running every day to check if there's been any update to the open data page, and if so, to pull it and update it into the database. And so this is happening on a daily basis, although it just depends on the schedule of all of the individual data sets. But as I was going through, and you can see on the building pages where it has each indicator, if you click into that to see the description, it'll also show you like when that particular indicator's data set was last updated on the page, so you can get a sense of how fresh all of that information is. We've also got a question about, is it possible to expand the research to a single landlord's portfolio? So like including, so you might have a landlord that has only some of their properties financed through Signature. So that's a great question and definitely would be a really nice addition to this. Unfortunately, because we had such a strict requirement of, we would need to be like perfectly sure about each property's landlord and have all of that information. And so we did the kind of like great lengths on UNHP side to actually manually research each one of these properties. So we were able to know the universe of the properties that were in Signature and then find out that information. But it's really difficult to get the landlord information directly out of the data in a really with a high degree of confidence that we would need for a project like this. And so it was like a little bit out of scope. What we do at JustFix, we have our own website called Who Owns What, which tries to deal with that issue, but more in a kind of data driven way without that manual research. And so the kind of determinations of ownership networks, the landlord portfolios are not perfect, but they're as best as we think you can do with the available data. Basically what we're doing in that case is rather than reading each scanned PDF and looking for the signatures the way that we had to for this, we're using HPD's property registration database where they list for every property a bunch of contacts for the building. So even if it's owned by an LLC, they'll have to list the head officer of that building along with their business address. And we do some kind of like network analysis basically to match all of those names and contact information and find communities in the data with the networks to see where all of these properties are likely to have a common owner based on all of these connections between them. And so that is the tool that's like most used for general purpose outside of Signature portfolio level, like landlord level organizing. And yeah, that's how that goes. Yeah, we've got a question about design question for the like co-design, co-creation process. Yeah, so basically it happened on like a fairly tight schedule, but we still involved a lot of interviews as the first part to really like first with like among ourselves, really like understanding the program and doing a lot of research with that. And on UNHP side, you all have a lot of connections with folks in the that have been doing this organizing, and then particularly around Signature. I don't know if you want to speak more to that, but in terms of the rest of the like design process, it was interviews, and then we'd have workshops with the different partners. So we might be meeting with like a bunch of tenant organizers, and we'd be like on a Zoom and have a kind of like a whiteboard essentially, and be able to sketch out ideas of what the site might look like and what are the features that you would want to know, and have a lot of discussion. Things like putting every indicator that we could think of on like stickies and having people sort them and which ones are useful for what sort of questions or what to change, or even starting with kind of what do you need to know about the building and why and what that would lead to in organizing strategy, or kind of in making the case to the joint ventures, and kind of all these different workflows and going through in that stage of the kind of initial ideas, and then making a lot of kind of prototypes that we can share with folks to get like live feedback on the direction that we're going, where they'd sit down and use the tool and simulate one of the tasks that they might be doing, and then keep iterating based on that. Yeah. Got a question. How would you advise tenants who are not actively organizing to join existing efforts? Is there a way to connect to current organizing through the dashboard, i.e. showing the groups organizing in the area? Or do you suggest another route? It's a great question. Anna, do you have an idea?
Yeah, through the dashboard, there definitely is the stabilizing NYC map, which shows which organizations are organizing in certain areas. And then there are also, we'll send out some follow-up information on the way that tenants could get involved, but both CPC and Santander created their own emails so that tenants can communicate their conditions to them. And there's certainly organizing going on around the portfolio itself. So there are groups such as Equitable Reinvestment Committee's Signature Subcommittee Group. It is organized by ANHD. And so there's a number of groups that are organizing. We'll definitely send out some information on who to contact if you're interested in organizing your building and it's in the portfolio.
Great, thanks. We've got a kind of like tech question about, yeah, so the actual tech stack. I mentioned the like kind of scheduled jobs to update the data set. So yeah, basically it's this NYCDB Python program that kind of does the actual job of getting the data and updating it. And then we use, it's called Kubernetes, which is like a kind of cloud cluster of virtual machines to run these different jobs. So we're using Docker, which is a way to like containerize, it's called, the process. So it's running the script within a kind of like isolated environment that has all the kind of dependencies set up. And we publish that and then are able to have those scheduled jobs that run every night, pull from there and do the updating process. All of this is on our public GitHub, and all in the kind of follow-up email, I can provide all the links and you can see a little bit of how the project is all pieced together. But yeah, everything we're doing on this is open source, so you can check it out. The request for more of a written explanation of the question of some of the like strategy and kind of financing details around that. So maybe that's something else we can follow up with, like links to like past presentations or other kind of background on. We know it's a little bit technical to get into all of the loan details, but yeah, there's a question. Plan to publicly share what buildings or blocks have been touched by different community organizations. That would be a good introduction to who wants to get involved. Yeah, that's a really great idea. Yeah, I think it's something that we've explored a little bit and had been working more kind of internally with the folks at Stabilizing NYC, since like they themselves have a little bit of this problem, since there's so many like coalition members. They want to have a sense of who's in what buildings and what's the status of like a tenant association, for example, that might be formed in each one of the buildings. And we had used all of the data that goes into the dashboard to build out mostly just like a simple kind of like Google Sheet system for them to track and update this information and coordinate amongst themselves. But it's not something that we've put out openly. I think there might be some hesitations around like announcing that you're organizing in a building maybe before you're ready to really go public with that and invite landlord retaliation. So I think there are probably some concerns on that side, but there might be some ways to think about that in the future. And we definitely have plans to try to adapt this and update the dashboard over time. Kind of conditions are changing in the buildings. Are there any other questions? I think I got to all of them in the chat, but yeah, definitely if you have any others, let us know. And yeah, and definitely happy to like reach out and talk with anybody that wants to follow up with more information.